Tonight on Life on the Rock, we have our Year in Review show. We'll show you some of our favorite interviews over the past year and much more. Well, welcome to Life on the Rock. This is our New Year's show. We look at a sort of a year in review, and we just chose like a few shows to recap tonight. And I think these shows kind of capture a little bit different themes we'll talk about in our Into the Vineyard Challenge. But tonight we're going to show you segments from interviews with Abby Johnson, Patrick Kenny, and Timmery Jaja. Abby Johnson, of course, was on the map because they made a full-length movie about her, Unplanned. It tells about her story of coming out of the abortion industry and becoming this powerful pro-life witness. And Patrick Kenny?
And Patrick Kenny, he is speaking about Father Willie Doyle, World War I chaplain. And if you haven't ever heard of Father Willie Doyle, you need to read his life. He was a great inspiration for Mother Teresa and others like Jose Maria Escriva. And he's just a very powerful witness for the faith. So
yeah, and I love that point. Mother Teresa read his story, so he's a powerful witness of holiness. And then Timmery Jaja, she has a radio show on Relevant Radio, and she's a podcaster, and she's a real pro-life, pro-chastity message, cultural warrior out there in Southern California. So I think she's a powerful witness to our faith. We're now going to show you the first interview with Abby Johnson.
Abby Johnson, it's good to have you here in Alabama on
Thank you for
WTN.
having me.
Just your story alone, I have to say that hopefully I don't get choked up, because literally I watched this movie twice within 24 hours. And that was just a couple days ago, and it's still kind of having an effect on me. And I read the book too, so I just wanted I wanted to get out of the way, and I wanted you to tell your story, first of all. Just a little bit of background of who you were and who you are now.
Sure, yeah. I worked for Planned Parenthood for 8 years. I was an abortion clinic director while I was there. Got involved as a college kid, didn't know anything about Planned Parenthood, didn't know really anything about the pro-choice or the pro-life movement, that debate. And, you know, I got involved because I believed that we were there to help women. I really got involved out of misguided compassion, and ended up leaving in October of 2009 after witnessing a live ultrasound guided abortion procedure where I saw a 13-week-old unborn child fight and struggle for his life against the abortion instruments. And I knew after seeing that there was life in the womb, that there was undeniable humanity inside the womb. And I knew that if those two things were true, then I was really on the wrong side of this debate. And so I ended up leaving.
This story that is told, the producers, Carrie and Chuck, do an amazing job. That has to be interesting, seeing your life played out by another actress, and then your husband to played out by an actor. What is that like?
Yeah, it's still strange. I've seen the movie a bunch of times, and it's still strange. It's I don't know that will ever feel normal, but you know, it's a very vulnerable feeling. It was, you know, it was one thing to write out my story. That was actually very healing for me to write out the book and to share that. But there's something very powerful about seeing your story visually. And a couple of the scenes in particular that I remember after I watched it the first time, I looked at my husband and I said, why did I do this? Why did I decide to do this? This just feels too raw.
I think particularly the scene after your second abortion, you know, when you had taken the RU486 pill.
Yep.
You know, that must have been, you know, very difficult to see that.
Yeah, that was one of the most difficult scenes for me to watch because it was one of the most difficult experiences for me to live out in my life. And so to see that done, but to see it done so well and so realistically. And that was one of the things that, you know, the directors told me when we first got this started was that, you know, they promised me that they would honor my story and my experiences, and they have kept that through this film. And you know, they didn't have to embellish this story. They didn't have to over dramatize the story. Abortion is bad enough on its own. We don't have to make it bigger or worse than it already is. And the thing about Unplanned is that I think really for the first time ever, our nation is going to have an opportunity to see the truth of abortion, to see what's really taking place in these clinics, and for all of us to experience a conversion of heart.
Yeah, that's what I felt like I experienced watching it. You know, I wanted to, you know, watching it, I broke down literally. And I think, you know, at the end of it, when it was all over, the first time I watched it, I'm like, Lord, this has got to stop. This has got to stop. You know, and what is my part as a Christian, as a priest? What is my part in my contribution in stopping this? Thank you so much, Abby, for coming to ytsync-en, sharing with us about Unplanned and just unveiling your story. I think it's going to touch many people throughout the world, Unplanned. And we want to encourage our viewers to pray for the success of Unplanned and all those throughout the world, to pray for you, to pray for your family, and also anyone involved with the promotion of this film.
Patrick, welcome to Life on
Thanks
the
a
Rock.
lot. Great to be here.
And you have written a great book called To Raise the Fallen, the story of Father Willie Doyle, chaplain during the First World War. And can you tell us, how did you come to know or find out about Father Willie Doyle?
So a friend recommended that I read the original biography of Father Doyle, written in the 1920s by his friend, Professor Alfred O'Reilly. And that was a blockbuster book. It was translated into all the major European languages. It ran through multiple editions. And when I read the book, I was absolutely astounded at the heroism and the generosity of Father Doyle. I'm from a town that's about 2 miles away from where Father Doyle was born and grew up, and I'd never heard about him. And I had two emotions about this. I had an amazement that I never heard about somebody who was so heroic and generous, but also a certain frustration that his memory had been allowed to recede in the last few decades. So I hope that the book and programs like this can bring his memory alive again and let people know and learn about this fascinating man.
Whenever I was reading the book, you read his letters during the war, and he goes into a lot of detail. It's pretty gruesome at times, but while you're reading it, he always remains very calm and very at peace. He has just this remarkable confidence and trust in God. But we find out earlier in his life, he had a nervous breakdown. Can you speak about that?
That's right. So at around the age of 20, the building he was in as a Jesuit student went on fire, and that had a big impact on him. He had to leave the Jesuits for a little while. We're told he had something of a nervous breakdown. He had to go home and recuperate. And it was unusual for somebody like that to be allowed return to the Jesuits, because there were many priests and many vocations at the time, and people who had struggles like that weren't always accepted back. And I'm told by Jesuits that it's almost a once-in-a-generation event that somebody would be allowed return after a health situation of that nature. But his story is fascinating because it's one of transformation, because we see somebody who had this mental health challenge because of the fire, who overcame it with his own efforts, but also with the grace of God, and was transformed to the point where 20 years later, he was a rock of courage and strength. And as you say, a very, very serene man in the midst of some of the most awful scenes of the war. to the point where soldiers would flock to him to get support and courage because he had this aura and peace and serenity about him.
And just reading about him, you get a very deep sense that he's very oriented to sacrifice. And we read even as a child, whenever he kind of first learned this, he first got this shilling and he wanted to go buy candy at a candy store. But he came across a beggar who needed food. And there was this dilemma between grace and nature. Do I give the shilling to this man or do I go spoil it on myself? But he gave it to the beggar. And he said it shook him up. It hurt him, but it was kind of that first approach to sacrifice. And that carried out throughout his life. Can you talk about the sacrifice?
Yeah, so sacrifice, I mean, anyone who's in a war or a chaplain in a war knows what sacrifice means in a way that many of us in the first world today don't necessarily because they lived a tough life. But Father Doyle was prepared for the sacrifices of war because of the sacrifices that he made throughout his life. So as a boy, as you said, as quite a young boy, he gave that shilling away and it was tough for him. And as he grew up and developed as a Jesuit student and then later on as a priest, he made many, many sacrifices. Some of them very simple. For instance, one resolution he had was not to take butter on his bread at breakfast. Now, if you're not Irish, that may not seem like a big sacrifice, but if you're Irish, you love your butter. And what's fascinating is you see he records in his diary his real struggles with this. You know, really tempted to take butter. I struggled. It's tough. But at the same time, he also did really heroic sacrifices in terms of quite tough penances.
And one of those sacrifices, I just remember reading it and it just struck me, is that he was working with like a doctor, a chaplain there in the trenches, and this guy was sick, and it's just cold, it's wet, and it's damp. And as a sacrifice, he offered to sleep on his stomach so this doctor could sleep on his back so he could stay dry. And that to me is just absolutely remarkable.
Well, I have the same reaction to that. You know, who wants somebody sleeping on your back when you're already in a tough situation in the trenches? And that to me is an incredible act of charity and sacrifice, which you cannot actually achieve or do without having trained yourself with smaller sacrifices along the way. And we see in Father Doyle, by the time he gets to the war, and even during his years in the war, the 2 years he spent as a military chaplain, an ongoing self-emptying where he's saying no to himself and letting God's grace fill him even more so that he can achieve even more and be more generous with
others. I think that's an interesting quality about him, because he is an extraordinary man of sacrifice. But you also see at the same time he did struggle, you know, and even writes in his diaries that these sacrifices of like giving up the bread or the butter, you know, it was like out of fear he just didn't want to do it. But he knew deep in his heart that God was always calling him to sacrifice more and more. And we see that throughout his life.
I mean, he felt he had a call to a particularly hard life. You know, even to the point where he would say, not just the hard life that an average priest or religious or Jesuit had at the time, which, you know, was quite a sacrificial and tough life. He really discerned and he spoke to others about it. He got approval from his confessor and from other superiors that he was called to an even greater heroism and an even greater sacrifice. And interestingly, much of that was oriented around reparation for the sins of priests. And he felt called to offer himself really as a victim in reparation for those sins. And the very last thing he wrote in his private diary, on the 10th anniversary of his ordination and just 3 weeks before he died, was that he offered up all his sufferings in the trenches to make up for the sins of other priests.
Wow. Father Willie Doyle was a remarkable man, and I wish we had more time to talk about him. Patrick, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Delighted.
Welcome, Timmery, to Life on the Rock.
Thank you for having me, Father.
Yes, and I wanted to have you on to talk about femininity, feminism, some of the issues we've raging in our culture today. And you speak eloquently about an identity crisis that we have.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we see this identity crisis all around us, from women who are struggling to find the balance between work life, home life balance, or maybe neither at all. And then others who are at the point where they don't even know who they are anymore with this radical gender and pro-gay ideology that's impacting children too.
Yeah. And our faith speaks into this crisis that we have today so eloquently about our identity. what do you teach people about? Because you're a speaker, radio show host.
Yeah, I think we have to start with, where did the identity crisis go so wrong? What happened? And, you know, I look at this and we have to turn back, and I know people say this often in the Catholic world, but the sexual revolution in many ways. And it's quite simple when we look at it. When we took babies out of sex, we then were able to take sex out of marriage. And from there were two groups that predominantly suffered first, and that was suddenly women were used as a means to one's own pleasure and reduced to an object, but also in the legal battle in the United States shows this as well. Suddenly there was a possibility for a child to be unwanted. And so if you look at the legal battles, you and I were talking about this before, we saw all of a sudden Griswold versus Connecticut decriminalized contraception here in the United States. Right after that, very quickly, we saw in the state of California under Ronald Reagan in the 60s that no-fault divorce was allowed. And then right after that, within a couple years, the fail-safe of abortion in 1973 with Roe versus Wade then became the law of the land and the nation. And that's because we needed it as a backup for contraception.
Yeah. So the sexual revolution giving us the pill and higher rates probably of promiscuity, greater acceptance, and so you're taking the procreative aspect out of it.
Right.
And that overarching purpose for sexuality.
Right. And there's no purpose for sexuality whatsoever. And that's why it makes sense that the sexual revolution, radical feminists, pro-abortion, pro-contraception feminists, including Planned Parenthood today, are some of the champions for the LGBTQ movement. And it's sad because I think in that act of taking babies out of sex and sex out of marriage, there's this justification for parents to have this idea that a child could be unwanted versus wanted. And so parenting changed. Children who are unwanted became a burden. It became an infringement on a woman's ability to be in the workforce and achieve what she wanted. And so children also have grown up with this identity crisis as well because of the attitude of parents.
So our identity, as Christians, we believe, you know, we image God in a powerful way. We have intellect and free will. And we're made, we can look at our very bodies, that we're made for self-giving love, and that it's procreative.
Right.
And if you start taking out aspects of this, everything gets messed up.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, you can start by, well, how are the first areas that we've seen women have suffered? Well, hormonal contraception is a group 1 carcinogen, estrogen and progesterone. You don't have to just look at medical journals in the United States, but you can look at the fine print on the contraception itself, or studies coming out of France, Israel, you name it, pointing to the impact on the woman's body, and to the point where you're seeing scarring in the fallopian tubes and other areas of the woman, that it can prevent future ability for a woman to conceive a child, along with other health issues.
Right. And so certainly the sexual revolution, you know, we're talking about a promiscuous culture, you know, not supporting marriage, hurts both men and women.
Right.
But it seemed like women share a heavier burden from the effects. One, sexually transmitted disease, more likely for women.
Right, and that's just the start of it, because I mean, all men and women can be carriers of a sexually transmitted disease, but STDs impact women more. At the end of the day, you know, there are some infections and diseases that can be treated if caught, but there are some that you will carry as a woman for the rest of your life. They can cause, among many other serious health issues, it can cause infertility. And this is something that a man can be a carrier showing little symptoms of, be infecting possibly other women, but it's women whose infertility will occur for them. And, you know, a great, you know, argument, I think even having to do with the abortion debate that not enough people are talking about, is how with the issue of abortion, even if you were to look at UN basic healthcare protocol, the basic protocol for abortion would be that a woman would receive a pelvic exam before having an abortion. If she doesn't and she has a sexually transmitted disease, those instruments are literally drawing that sexually transmitted disease up through her reproductive tract, spreading the STD, and possibly making it so that she will never be able to have a child.
And then there's like the psychological kind of trauma of a promiscuous culture. You know, women I think statistically, they're looking for more of a relationship, a lasting relationship, and they're not getting that in this sexual revolution culture that we live in.
Right. You know, we have to remember that not only are we physically uniting ourselves to each other, but we're emotionally bonding and chemically bonding in the sexual act. You know, I've worked on college university campuses and with young people, and I could always tell you when I'm talking to a young woman who has recently gone through a breakup, which of them have been sexually active and which of them have not been, because the dopamine that gives that sense of pleasure high, the oxytocin that creates a connection, a bonding moment, the serotonin, that sense of serenity, it's gifts of chemical bonding that are meant to help unite a marriage and build it up, because marriage is difficult enough as it is.
Right. So I keep saying this, the Christian message is a marriage culture, but you don't even have to open the Bible to know these things, right?
Right.
For marriage is the place of a healthy and fulfilling, satisfying sex life, and the place to raise children with a father and a mother. And the sexual revolution kind of just obliterates that.
It absolutely does. And I mean, one area that we see people struggling, because we took babies out of sex, we allowed for sex outside of marriage, we've already said that. But what has divorce done? It's really destroyed that natural born right of a child to its mother and father. I mean, that's what we should be talking about when we talk about this redefinition of marriage.
And there's tons of data about the importance of both mother and father for healthy development of the child. And that really speaks against gay marriage, even on the natural law level.
Oh, it's fascinating. And even if we just look at studies done on rats and what we learn, the same thing happens with humans. The more that the father, and it's predominantly the father, engages in things such as rough and tumble play with the children, he teaches the child delayed gratification. They're developing the ability to reason in the child. They're developing parts of the brain in the baby that the mom wouldn't develop because she doesn't engage in that level of rough and tumble play that the father does.
Right. Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me, Father Mark.
I think our guest tonight captures something about evangelization. This is a show about evangelization. I think Chaplain Willie Doyle captures holiness.
Very holy man.
And what impressed you about his holiness?
Well, he just had a remarkable discipline when it came to prayer, when it came to fasting, but really his service to be with the men in combat at any hours. I mean, he really just laid down his life. He just went through a lot of suffering and was always just a very strong father figure for all the men. They all looked to him as a real light there in just a world of darkness.
Right.
And but eventually, you know, he was killed in battle, and but he touched the lives of everyone that he knew there out on the field. And a lot of people may not know this, but before even the war, he was a retreat director, you know, retreat master. He's got just a lot of beautiful reflections and works, and great works on the priesthood and the vocations. And actually, Patrick Kinney gives a great link to where you can find all that on his website.
And he was in the trenches of World War I, terrible situation, but he stresses how it begins with just ordinary things done with great love. He loves St. Therese. That applies to all of us. So with that personal holiness, we have something to give that can drive us into evangelizing others. And I think Timmery Millington shows that in such a powerful way. You know, she's out in Southern California, a radio show, engaging the culture on the most divisive, explosive issues there are about sexuality, pro-life issues, same-sex attraction issues. And she's taking the Catholic faith right into that and talking to young people, talking about it on a radio show with a great fearlessness that I respect and admire about her. So I think it's a witness to us to engage the culture, our gift. She can do it in Southern California. We can do it where we're at, and to spread the gospel as best we can. I think Abby Johnson captures something about, you know, we might be afraid our fallenness. Well, God redeemed her story and is using it in a very powerful way in the abortion industry now, pro-life, that nothing's beyond God's redemption, and he can use it. He can draw good out of evil. And finally, tonight we also, with sadness, some sadness, are going to wish Ryan McGahee well. He's our director for Life on the Rock the past couple of years. He's done an outstanding job been on various shoots, has a lot of technical skill, brought a lot of energy to the show that I personally appreciate, and a very faithful Catholic family man. So he's going out to Beaverton, Oregon, I think largely for family reasons, to be close to family. He's going to work with the Sisters of Mary and still do his video work and some maybe freelance work for the network. So we want to wish him well, Ryan, and keep him in our prayers. So now we'll send you into the vineyard with a challenge. Be witnesses. Look at these interviews, these guests we have on the show. Take something from their story and be a witness yourself in this culture. May our Heavenly Father bless you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We'll see you next week on Life on the Rock.
All my devotion is like sinking sand. I've nothing to cling to but your sweet hand. No clear